Hi, I'm Kyle Harth, and I want to talk to you a little bit about handguns. So, a lot of people, whether they're a new user or whether they've been a rifle user for a while, start to look at handguns. And people look at handguns for a lot of different reasons. It may be you want one for self-defense. It may be that you have an heirloom that's been handed down through the family and you want to know more about it or be safe with it. Handguns fill a specific purpose, but that purpose may be different for different people. What's important is understanding what kind of handgun you have or what kind that you might need, and then understanding the different aspects of those handguns and how they can be used. Primary is always safety, so the more you know, the more educated you are, the more safe you're going to be, which is again our primary concern. Beyond that, you need to start to learn how that handgun operates. You need to learn about handgun culture because things change when you use a handgun. Things change when you carry a handgun or you own a handgun. Lots of considerations. This video is going to try to help you understand what some of those considerations are, and it'll probably lead to other questions that you can search out answers for. But we're going to do our best to be comprehensive. And for those first-time handgun users or first-time handgun owners, or even if you just have interest in it, this will be the video that explains those things to you. All right, we talked about the most important thing being safety. So let's talk about some safety rules. Safety rules will always apply when you're dealing with firearms. That's whether you're at the range, whether you're cleaning them at home, even if you handle them in a store when you're looking at them as you start to think about that purchase. So the first and most important rule is all firearms are loaded. Now, you'll hear that being said as treat all firearms as if they are loaded. Same thing. But what it means is an unloaded firearm is never a surety. You don't know that that firearm is truly unloaded. Even if you check it, even if you go through all the safety procedures to make sure that it's unloaded, it still can be a dangerous tool and it could still be something that you don't understand and can hurt somebody. So we treat them all as if they are loaded. If we always do that, we will never have an accident. The second rule will be never point your muzzle at anything you're not willing to destroy. A firearm, whether it's a pistol or a rifle, or a shotgun even, is designed to destroy the things that you shoot at. Therefore, we would never point that handgun at something that we didn't want to destroy. So every time you make that conscious choice to point that firearm, you need to make sure that it's something that is okay to shoot at. Otherwise, we keep that muzzle pointed in a safe direction. Rule number 3 is keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. Your trigger finger is your definitive safety. Some weapons have manual safeties. It's a physical device that either blocks the hammer, blocks the sear, somehow keeps that gun from firing. But again, it's a mechanical device, and mechanical devices can fail. The best safeties that you have are your finger and your brain. If you keep your finger off the trigger and you keep conscious thought of where you're pointing that firearm and you keep the first 2 rules in mind, you'll never have an accident. The final rule is positive identification of your target. So whether that's at the range, whether that's in a hunting situation, or even in a defensive situation, you have to know what it is you are shooting at, and you have to have properly identified it. If you don't, you're going to make a mistake, and that mistake can be fatal. Therefore, we always know what our target is, we always know what's in front of it, behind it, and to the sides of it. Because should we miss it, or should we penetrate it, we need to know where that bullet is going. We own every bullet that comes out of every gun that we fire, and you need to know what that target is. So I can't overemphasize how important these safety rules are. If you follow these 4 simple safety rules, you'll always be safe around any firearm. Now you'll go to places where you'll see other kinds of rules posted. You'll see maybe a rewording of these kind of rules. But if you adhere to these simple rules, you'll always be safe. This goes for novices all the way up to experts. We all have these rules in place because what we do with firearms is inherently dangerous. However, we do everything we can by using these rules to make it as safe as we possibly can. When you start considering handguns, you need to know the types of handguns that are out there, and you need to know the parts that comprise those handguns. As you start to understand the basic parts and the 2 different main types of handguns, it'll start to narrow down what your choices are as far as what's going to work for you. It'll also maybe explain what you have if for some reason you have one of those family heirlooms or something that's been passed down or given to you. So let's talk about handguns. We'll start with the simplest form first, and those would be revolvers. So standard revolvers will all have very similar parts. They will have a barrel to direct the bullet downrange. Now barrels will come in different lengths. Typically, as your barrel gets longer, you'll get a higher accuracy. And as it gets shorter, you'll get a little less accuracy, but more concealability or easier to use. So again, when you look at barrels, all handguns have them, you're looking at what works best for in your situation. Now when you come back from the barrel, you'll notice that it attaches to the frame. All handguns will have a frame. They can be made out of all different kinds of materials. This one's stainless steel. We have aluminum frames, polymer frames, all different kinds. It depends on how much weight that the gun will carry, which affects recoil, but it also affects how easy it is to carry as far as having that kind of weight. So if you're carrying it every day, sometimes a lighter gun is better. If you're shooting a heavy caliber, sometimes a heavy frame, like a steel frame, is better because it'll reduce some of that felt recoil. But the frame is just the rigid structure that holds all the components. The cylinder on a revolver holds the actual cartridges. So the cartridges are loaded into the cylinder, and as you pull the trigger or action the hammer, or a combination of both, that cylinder will rotate and align the cartridges in with the barrel so that they can be fired correctly. Then you also have a hammer. The hammer that will operate to the rear and forward. It does that based on how you pull the trigger, or depending on the action of your gun, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Depending on that action, it could be that you have to manually operate it. And then of course it's got the handle. Along the top, and it's usually in conjunction with the barrel and the slide or the frame, depending on whether we're talking about a revolver or a semi-automatic, you'll find your sights. Your sights will differ in all kinds of ways. This is a fixed front sight, and in the back, and I'll turn it so you can see it, in the back it is a notch. So the notch is the sight alignment notch that you use to place the front sight in and then on target. You'll see all different kinds, and as we go through those different kinds on these different handguns that we have, I'll show you some different ones. Now, that is one revolver, this is another. You see that the components are very similar. Revolvers all will look very similar to one another. This one has a very short barrel on it, which again, easier to carry, easier to wield. However, you're going to have a loss in accuracy and a loss in some velocity when you go to a smaller barrel or a shorter barrel. So again, things to consider. But you'll see the same components. It's got a frame. It's got the front sight post and the rear sight notch in line with it. It's got a cylinder that rotates your cartridges into place and holds them in place. And it's got a hammer and a grip. Now, trigger, obviously we're going to have a trigger on all our weapons, and the trigger will perform different functions. So we'll take a look at one other variant of a revolver. You'll notice that this variant has all the same components: barrel, frame, sights, cylinder. However, what it doesn't have is a hammer. This is called a hammerless revolver. A lot of people refer to this as a pocket pistol because when you have it in your pocket, you could actually fire it from inside a jacket pocket or inside your clothes because there's no hammer operating forward and back to catch on your clothes or to get impeded by your clothes and then have a misfire. So a lot of people will call this a pocket pistol, and if you wondered why, that's kind of why. Hammerless revolvers are typically used by people that want to conceal a handgun or carry it in a concealed manner because there's no spur to hang up, whereas on this handgun you've got this large spur. On this one it's very smooth and you won't do it. Now there is one in there, it's just inside and concealed instead of being a big device that you manually operate. So let's talk about these handguns. This is the simplest version of a revolver. This would be a single action. A single action, what that means is you have to deliberately cock the hammer back, which loads a spring that will bring it forward, and it catches in a notch. And I'll show you what that looks like. When you pull the hammer back, you'll watch that the cylinder will rotate the next cartridge into place, and the hammer will lock into position. Once that hammer is locked into position, the trigger will now activate that and allow that hammer to go forward, strike the cartridge will ignite, and it will send it down the barrel. This is what we call single action because it only does one thing. You cock it, and it fires. So the cocking mechanism is the only thing that this will do. Now, versus a double action pistol, which most double action pistols will operate as a single action. So in other words, I can manually load the hammer, and now this weapon will fire just like the single action does. When I pull the trigger, it will let this hammer go forward and send the cartridge down range. However, the difference between a single action, that first one, and this one, a double action, is that the trigger will do two things, not just one. The trigger, if pulled, will actually load the hammer itself. See the hammer coming back and the cylinder rotating that cartridge into place. And then as it gets to a point that's forward or back as far as it will go, it also will release that. So, single action, you load the hammer manually and you let it go with the trigger, or double action, where you use the trigger to load the hammer to a point where it will release itself. That's the double action. So it will do two things versus one. That trigger loads and fires. Whereas in a single action, it just fires when you pull the trigger. Now, when you get to something like a hammerless revolver, and we talked about this one a minute ago, you'll see that it is also a double action. But unlike the other double action, it cannot function as a single action because it does not have a manual hammer that you can bring back. So understanding whether you're looking at a double action revolver or a single action revolver will allow you to understand not only how they operate, but how to do it safely and whether or not that fits the particular style of handgun that you're interested in. The last thing that we want to look at when we're looking at those revolvers, so we understand what the components are now, and we also understand what a single action versus a double action means. So once you've got that down, now you have to look at the cartridge caliber that you're going to carry, because they're all different calibers, and revolvers come in the myriad of calibers that are out there. So you're going to look at that, but more importantly, when we're looking at the actual components, you need to look at how many rounds does that handgun hold, and then how do we load it and unload it. So there's different styles for every revolver, but they have some similarities. So when we go back to this single action pistol, you'll notice that there is a opening here, this gate. So this gate is where you open, and it will allow you to individually put a cartridge into each opening in the cylinder. And as you rotate the cylinder, you can either load or unload cartridges into that opening. Now, when you need to, sometimes they'll stick, and if you can't get it out, most of your handguns that are designed this way will also have a rod. This one has a lever at the end here, and as you push it, you can see that it inserts a rod all the way back through that cylinder and will push either an empty or a live cartridge out of there. So when you're unloading it, that is a feature that you can look at as well to see if the handgun has something like that. Now that's a side gate. So when you now look at some of the other handguns, we'll go to this double action revolver. The double action revolver is different. You'll notice that it doesn't have a gate that you can open on either side. But what it does has, if it has an actuating knob or an actuating lever or a button you can push. That is going to be to open the gate. This will be a swing gate that allows the whole cylinder to swing out of place. So when we have to press it, you can push on the cylinder, and now the cylinder is completely out, and you can also see the cartridges. So the cartridges can now be loaded or unloaded, and then simply closed into position, and it will reset itself. Now, just like the single action that we looked at, it had the ability to unload the cartridges. This one also has it, but it's a different mechanism. If you'll notice, when we push this lever back like this, what it's going to do is each individual cartridge has a rim, a small rim that comes off the back of it. This engages that rim, and when you push it, it allows you to eject or remove those cartridges from the cylinder all at one time. So whereas that single action pistol did it one at a time as you roll through the cylinders, this one will actually do both at the same time. And this hammerless is almost an exact duplicate. So if you look at this one, Same thing, button to push, cylinder slides open, individual cartridges are loaded, and just exactly the same as the other one, it has a lever that you can push that allows you to eject those cartridges. So those are the ways that you can access to either load or unload your revolver. Now again, these are the three that we have available to us. There can be some slight differences in different kinds of revolvers. So knowing what you have and knowing how it functions is one of the biggest important facts when you look at using it safely. Semi-automatics do it differently. Semi-automatics actually load and unload a cartridge based on when you fire. So as you fire a cartridge, the recoil from that cartridge will allow the slide to operate backwards and unload or eject the spent cartridge, but it will also pick up a new one and ride it forward. So that's why it's called a semi-automatic. We'll get into the specifics of how it operates later, but that's the reason why it's called a semi-automatic, because it's doing some of those functions automatically. Now, when we look at semi-automatics, we're going to have very similar components. The components of a semi-automatic gun, just like the revolvers, consist of a barrel. The barrel is on the inside of this frame. It sits from here to here. So that's your barrel length, because remember we talked about barrel length will give us not only speed of the bullet, but it will give us accuracy to that bullet. So I will lock this back and you can see the barrel sits inside of this frame. Now, as the frame goes, just like on a regular handgun, you've got a frame that sits below, but semi-automatics will have a slide. The slide is the actual moving part, thus called a slide, that slides back and forth and is the action or allows the action of the pistol in that semi-auto function. Below that is your frame. Your frame, again, made of all different kinds of materials, and it supports the major components of the gun. It also has a hammer. Just like revolvers, some will have hammers, some will not have hammers, and we'll get into some specifics on that and how it functions. And again, a trigger. And just like revolvers, those trigger functions will change on semi-automatics as well. So again, lots of things to know about how the gun operates, but most importantly, for now, we want to know that we have a barrel, a slide, a frame, a trigger, and a hammer. Once you have those components in mind, all of them kind of look the same, and then we'll get into the differences as we move along. Along the top of this slide, you'll see that we also have sights. Just like on the revolvers, these are fixed sights. But whereas the first revolver we looked at had a notch that was notched out and allowed you to look at the front sight through the rear notch, this one has its own fixed rear sight. The fixed rear sight does the exact same thing, it's just a different style. Now this one's non-adjustable, but some of them are adjustable, and I'll show you one of those. This is a target pistol, and target pistols typically will have adjustable sights because again, you're looking for a little more accuracy, and it's something that you want to be able to adjust to move the strike of the round. Defensive pistols a lot of times don't have a lot of moving parts because they want them to be simple and effective. But when you're looking for more accuracy, you're going to see that there's a little bit of variance when you get to the rear sights. And the rear sights are typically the ones that will have the adjustability. Now, when you look at front sights, they all are very similar to one another, but you may find that they have red dots, glow-in-the-dark dots, tritium as some manufacturers use. But there's all different kinds of little variances, but the actual basic makeup of front sights really stays the same. The difference is going to be in the rear, and you just kind of got to look at what you want and what you need and whether it works for you. So those are the major components, and no matter which of these handguns we looked at in the semi-automatics that we have, they're all going to have the barrel, the slide, the frame, the trigger, and the hammer. And those are going to be the major component parts of the actual handgun. So now that we've got the major components of those semi-automatic handguns, let's talk about how they hold their cartridges and how they feed their cartridges. So remember when we looked at revolvers, we had a cylinder, and that cylinder was the part that held the cartridges, and then as it rotated, aligns them into the barrel to be fired. Now, we don't have a cylinder on a semi-automatic handgun, so what we have is a magazine. So on this 45, you'll see that we have a magazine release. So when we push this button, the magazine will release from the bottom. This is what holds the cartridges inside the weapon system. It holds the cartridges, just like a cylinder, and it aligns the cartridges to be loaded into the barrel, or into the chamber of the barrel. So the magazine does the job that the cylinder does, but it does it in a semi-automatic handgun. Now there are differences in magazines. So magazines are very specific to the weapon that you're using, so they're specific to the caliber and the make and model that you've got. But there's differences in them. So when we take this is a single stack magazine. If you look at it, this will hold one .45 cartridge right on top of another as you put them in. And different ones will have different capacities, so you need to know how many rounds your handgun will hold. But single stack magazines are very simple. They stack the rounds right on top of each other in a single stack. It limits somewhat the capability of how many cartridges your handgun can carry. However, what it also does is it slims the grip, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. If we take a double stack magazine, while it looks the same at the very top, you'll notice that it's much wider across the back than a single stack magazine. So the single stack magazine stacks them one right on top of the other, where the double stack magazine, as you insert them, stagger them left, right, left, right, left, right, all the way down the magazine, and it increases the capacity. Where this magazine may hold 7 or 8, this magazine will hold 16 or 17, depending on caliber, and that can vary just a little bit, but you can see the great amount of difference. But what it does in effect as well is it widens the grip of the gun, because these have to go into the frame of the pistol. And when these are inserted, this one, obviously, being the double stack, needs more room, which widens the grip. So a lot of people not only look at the magazine capacity as far as how many rounds they can carry, they also look at magazines because a single stack would be easier for someone with a smaller hand to hold versus a double stack, which may be easier for someone with a larger hand to manage. So you're looking at what it is I'm trying to accomplish, what it is that I need to do, and what's my physical anatomy? How do I handle this gun? So it's really important when you're looking at pistols to go to a place that's a good place that's got a lot of choices and handle those firearms. Remember, we're going to learn about them, we're going to handle them safely, but being able to have something that fits your hand correctly is real important, and the magazine capacity is going to play an important part in that. So another consideration that you might think about when you're looking at those single stack versus those double stack magazines is concealability. So a very thin pistol is obviously easier to hold in a smaller hand, but what it's also easier to do is it's easier to conceal. So if you're going to go get your concealed weapons permit and you're going to carry as a protective feature, a lot of times you're going to look at that weapon system and see, how does it print? How am I going to carry it? What kind of holster am I going to carry it in? And so how thin it is going to greatly benefit you. If you look at some of these very small pistols, the subcompacts are even smaller down to these pocket size pistols, you'll notice that a lot of them are single stack magazines. Those single stack magazines, again, very thin, one right on top of the other, are going to allow that pistol to be easily concealed, and when you put it below clothing or in a pocket, what it's doing is, because it's not very thick, it's also not showing that it's in that pocket or in that holster. So again, being part of concealing a pistol is you truly want it to be concealed. So another consideration when you're looking at the magazine capacity is, what am I going to do with this handgun? So let's look at some of the other components of these semi-automatic handguns. Going back to our 45, you'll notice that it has some levers and mechanisms on this side. We talked about the magazine release, which is this. The magazine release, obviously, when we push it, we depress that, it releases the magazine so that we can take that out to unload or load the gun, or to replace it if we fired it until it was empty and we want to put a fresh one in. So again, magazine release. Now, you'll also notice that there's two others. This is a slide stop or a slide release. It depends on what you're doing with it. If you're bringing the slide to the rear, it's a slide stop or a slide lock. and it will hold it in the open position so that you can inspect the chamber and make sure that it's empty. So we can look inside this handgun and we can see that there's no round in the chamber because we were able to manually lock it into position. Now what that also does is when it is locked into position, it is now also your slide release. So it is a slide lock and a slide release depending on which direction of travel you're pushing this slide back and forth. That's the slide release. Now to the rear of that and ergonomically positioned so that you can activate it with your thumb is the safety. So this safety slides up and down, and we have to release the magazine or release the slide. So we let the slide go forward by depressing the slide release, and now you can see that this is a manual safety that you can operate with your thumb while you're holding the pistol. Up and down, and it will activate. Now, different handguns have different safeties. So if we look at this one, for instance, this one also has a magazine release, just like the other one did. Push it, releases our magazine. It also has a slide lock or a slide release, depending on which direction it's traveling. And if we release that, you'll notice that it has a safety, up and down. Very similar. And again, where they usually position those safeties is so that as you hold the handgun, you're activating it with your thumb because it will sit at the rear of the handgun and on the side. And that's the way they're designed to activate. Take a look at one more safety. They're all very similar. Again, magazine release, slide lock, slide release, and then the safety. This one actually has a red dot that'll show you when it's firing, and it has, when it's up, it will be covering that red dot and you cannot see that. That's a common system too on some hunting rifles, but a lot of your handguns too will have that red dot that you can see when it's activated. So as you're learning about your handgun, it's real easy to be able to identify it. And also, if you look at it from a distance without handling the firearm, you can see whether it's on safe or not on safe. And again, our primary safety is our brain and our finger keeping off that trigger and not pointing that weapon in a direction that's going to be dangerous to anyone. Now, you'll notice that some handguns, like this one, appear to not have a safety. This one has a magazine release. It has a slide lock, slide release. But if you'll notice, there's no safety. There's no safety on this side, and there's no safety on this side. However, if you look at the trigger of this particular weapon, you'll notice that it has a slight protrusion in it. That little protrusion actually has to be displaced. In other words, when you put your finger on the trigger, you push that small piece back to the main part of the trigger prior to the trigger being able to be pulled. So in other words, if I tried to pull this trigger, but I did not grab that piece, it will not fire. However, that is a built-in safety, and you'll see this on a lot of handguns. A lot of the modern semi-automatics have this feature. But now, if it is depressed, you can see that it's depressed, and I'm not pushing the trigger, I'm only pushing that little safety bar. As I depress it, then if I were to push the trigger, it will actually fire. So it's a safety, but when you look at it in relativity to the other ones that are protrusions that come off the frame or the slide, that one's different. And so different pistols will have different kinds of safeties. Now the magazine releases, usually in the same place. Slide stops, slide releases, very similar locations. But when you get into safeties on semi-automatic handguns, and even handguns generally, you're gonna see them in different places. So you need to ask those questions and you need to look at them. And if you do buy a handgun, you need to be very familiar with how yours goes into safe mode, because obviously safety is our primary concern. Another external safety that we can consider when we look at handguns is a grip safety. So just like the other mechanical safeties that we looked at, as far as activating levers up and down or trigger safeties, this one also has a grip safety. Now some people call that a beaver tail because the beaver tail is actually up here and it fits in the swell of your hand, but the actual actuating part of it is this part right here that I'm pushing. So when this weapon is in battery, even with the safety off on this side, the weapon, if I don't depress the grip safety, will not fire, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Pushing on the trigger will not activate and drop that hammer, because again, this one has an additional safety. So if your hand is not fully on the weapon system, gripping it as it is to be fired, it won't fire. Now, again, pressing on the trigger, nothing happens. But when we depress the grip safety, like we were holding it in our hand and ready to fire it, now when I press the trigger, the hammer will drop. So again, another external safety feature. These are very, very common in 45s. It was one of the original design features of the 45, but you will also find them from other manufacturers and in other weapon systems or in other pistol systems. Now, that covers kind of the broad stroke of what you'll see as external safety features. But there's also a lot of internal safety features that gun manufacturers put into their handguns in order to make them more safe. And those are usually mechanical in nature, and they can either disconnect a firing pin, they can block a firing pin, they can keep a sear from engaging, they can do all different kinds of things. But I can't show them to you because they're all internal. So it's important that you ask about your handgun and you ask the manufacturer, read on the manufacturer's websites, ask that person at your local gun store about the not only external features of the handgun, but the internal features of the handgun, because a lot of those will keep you just as safe as those external features. So outside of the single action and double action pistols in both the revolvers and the semi-automatics, when you get into semi-automatics, you also have the most prevalent system these days, which is the striker-fired system. The striker-fired system has no external components like you would rely on to identify whether it was a single action or a double action. In other words, it has no external hammer. You can see on the back of this, unlike the 45 or unlike the revolvers, there is no hammer. What actually happens is, as the slide goes back and forth, the slide is cocking internal components. And when I say that, what I mean is it's loading springs. So the mechanism of action of the slide moving back and forth is allowing internal components, as opposed to external components, to be compressing springs, locking parts into position. And what that does is now, in turn, when you pull the trigger, allows only internal components to move. So as you pull the trigger, the internal components, much like the external components, you just can't see them operating, move forward. And then again, there's internal safeties, different kinds of blocks, all different kinds of things. But striker-fired systems are becoming more and more prevalent, and they're probably one of the more prevalent systems that's popular today. So you need to understand how those work. And again, it has a lot of the same components, but they're just working in a different fashion. Because when you compress them and make them small and put them on the inside, you're actually loading springs, and that pistol stays in a constant state of readiness. There's still safeties in place, whether they're external or internal safeties, but the components stay ready and in place, and those springs are compressed. So when you do release the safeties or engage the trigger or both, those components now fire the handgun. So a little different than what we talked about when we did single and double actions. But again, striker-fired pistols are important to know about because, again, you're going to see them a lot. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about as a consideration to what type of handgun we would look at is size. So size is going to make a big difference on how we're going to use it, how we're going to conceal it, if we're going to conceal it. And it's going to also talk about recoil, it's going to talk about accuracy, because remember we talked about those different barrel lengths are going to give us greater accuracy, but it also gives us less ability to conceal the handgun. And then the other thing about size is that capacity in those magazines we talked about. So when you look at the different sizes of handguns, they're generally going to be based on certain categories, and those categories will be basically a full-size handgun. These typically are what a full-size handgun will look like. Full-size handguns can be in different varieties. This one obviously is about a full-size handgun. Again, when you look at them in relativity to hand size, obviously hand size is different, but when you look at them in relativity to hand size, full size will look about this big. Then you'll go into what a lot of people call a compact. A compact typically is in the same calibers as a full size with a little bit diminished capacity to carry. So in other words, it carries less cartridges. So a compact will go down in size to make it easier to wield, easier to conceal, easier to carry. But again, you still have the full features of a particular cartridge. And a lot of manufacturers will make a full size and a compact that are very, very similar to one another, but just difference in size. Then when you go below that, you'll go into a subcompact. This one is probably an in-between between a compact and a subcompact. Again, you look at relativity to hand size. And then these are good examples of true subcompacts or pocket pistols, micro guns. You'll hear different people refer to them as all different kinds of things. But again, these are very, very diminutive guns, very small guns that are designed really for carrying in a purse or a pocket or a very deep concealed rig when you need to have something as an emergency to get you out of trouble. The smaller the gun is and the less capacity, the more apt you are to use it as a defensive system as much as an offensive system. So typically you won't see police or law enforcement carrying the micro-sized, the subcompact sized guns. You see them being carried, the full-size guns, because again, greater capacity, greater accuracy, and they're not concealing those handguns. They use them as part of their duty, as part of their equipment that they use for work. Whereas as you start getting smaller and smaller with your handguns, you'll notice that you're leaning more towards carrying that handgun. And revolvers are the same way. So if you look at this big single action revolver, again, this is something that's going to be carried in a holster. This is typically a Western style pistol, and it would be carried in an old Western style holster. A lot of reenactment shooters like to use pistols like this, and a lot of people that just think that's a lot of fun to do, and it is. But again, this is not something that's very small. This is a full-size frame pistol. If you wanted to carry something and you were looking at a revolver, again, you would start downsizing. Shorter barrels, a little smaller frame. This one's hammerless. And again, now this gives you the capability, just like diminishing the size in a semi-automatic, now you have the capability to have something that's just a little more practical for what it is you may be doing. So when you look at all those different sizes, you really have to determine what is it you're trying to accomplish with your handgun. What's your goals as an owner? And then you start to look at all the other features that we've already talked about, but again, size being an important one as well. We're going to talk a little bit about the cartridges that you'll put into handguns. Now, cartridges, which as they should be referred to, are an entire system. So a lot of times you'll hear these referred to as bullets. A bullet is actually a part of the cartridge. It is not actually the whole cartridge. The bullet is the end of it, is the projectile. Bullet, projectile can be used interchangeably. And the projectile is what is expelled from the cartridge casing as it travels downrange through the barrel. Now, the casing, the cartridge casing, so you'll hear this called a shell casing. When it's empty, you'll hear it called a shell. But it's a cartridge casing, same thing. And what it is it's holding the next component, which is inside, the inside component being the powder. The powder will also be referred to as propellant because it is the part that makes it the gases that expand and push the bullet down range. Now, in the very end of it, you'll notice this is a center fire cartridge. So in the center of it, there is a primer. You can see the difference in the primer versus the external part of the cartridge case. The primer, think of as an igniter for the powder. What it is when the firing pin strikes this, it creates an almost explosive charge. Now remember, explosive just means it burns much more rapidly than regular burning. So a very bright flash of powder comes out, very hot, and when that happens, it ignites the powder inside the cartridge casing, gases develop, it pushes the bullet out into the barrel, lands and grooves capture it, and start it spinning and project it downrange and out of the barrel. So knowing the components, again, bullet, cartridge casing, powder, and primer will allow you to not only speak intelligently about the ammunition you're putting in your handguns, but it makes you understand also how those things are functioning and how they're making your pistol function. Now, That's a center fire cartridge, because remember, we saw the primer was in the center of the cartridge. When that is hit, you can see the difference. This is a spent cartridge, or a spent shell casing, and this is a unfired cartridge. You can see that there's a small dent in the center of the center fire cartridge, right in the primer, and that's because this one's already been fired. Now, when you go to the next type of cartridge, which is a rimfire cartridge, a rimfire cartridge has all the same components. It has a bullet, a cartridge casing, and inside there's the powder or propellant. Now, if we turn it to the end, you'll notice that unlike the centerfire cartridge, which has a primer in the end, the rimfire cartridge has no primer in the end. The reason being is in the actual rim of the cartridge is an internal primer. And so when we say it's a rim fired versus a center fired, we can see that when you have a casing that's been fired, you can look at it and you can see that there's this dent in the edge of the rim. That rim is where the firing pin struck, thus igniting the powder and propelling the bullet downrange. So again, the strike being on the rim versus the strike being down the center in a primer. They still have primers, but the primer of the rimfire is internal. Other than that, it's the same components, you just can't see them. So those are the components of a cartridge system, and those are the way a cartridge system works when it fires. When that firing pin hits the primer, whether it's a rimfire or a centerfire, it has a very bright flash, almost an explosion inside the cartridge, which ignites the powder. That creates a bunch of gas pressure, which pushes the bullet downrange through the barrel. So, now let's talk about some misconceptions about ammunition. Ammunition in itself is not inherently dangerous. A lot of people think that if you add an enormous amount of heat to a cartridge casing or to a full cartridge, it will explode. That is not true. It will not fire if it's set on fire. It will not propel the bullet if it's set on fire. Point in fact is, when I was in the military early on, we had to destroy huge lots and piles of ammunition. And the way they destroyed it is they dug a pit, they filled the pit with ammunition, they soaked it in diesel, and they burnt it. So what happens when you do that is, because the bullet is so much heavier than the cartridge casing, the bullet stays put when the gas expands, and the cartridge casing will fly, but not very far and not as dangerous. So it doesn't explode. It's just not the way it works. So another thing that people think is if you crush ammunition, it can also go off. Chances of that are very, very slim. Ammunition is not designed that way. It is very specifically designed to be struck in the location, either the rim or the center for a primer strike, to allow the gases or the powder to be ignited and the gases expanded. Unless you do that, it's very difficult to inadvertently allow a cartridge to explode or to fire or to burn the powder inside. In other words, dropping it on the ground typically won't accomplish that. So now that you have your ammunition, you know what the components are, you know some of the misconceptions about ammunition. Ammunition is fairly expensive. If you're buying good ammunition, especially defensive ammunition, it is even more expensive. So how do we properly store that ammunition? We need to store it in a safe place, obviously, because you're safeguarding and protecting something that goes into your handguns and has cost you money. So we want to protect it. The other thing is we want it to be in a cool, dry place. Dry being the most important. Ammunition, in the way it's built, is crimped. In other words, it is pressure fit to crimp this cartridge casing down onto this bullet, and when that happens, it creates a seal. Now, different manufacturers seal their ammunition in different ways. All of it is quite a bit water resistant, however, it is not waterproof. And in long, damp exposures, so in other words, if you're storing all your ammunition in a very damp basement, it's probably a bad choice, because over time, that humidity could seep into those rounds, and that damp moisture could get in. It can wet your powder, and it can make your ammunition not work well. So again, dry being the key. Anytime you're going to store it in a dry location. If you can't store it in a dry location, either use some desiccant in a sealed tube so that it absorbs the moisture instead of your ammunition, or you can use a dehumidifying rod, very similar to what you would do in a gun safe. The other thing is what kind of boxes to store it in. Well, the beauty of ammunition is it comes in a box, typically. If it comes in a box, these boxes are obviously suitable for storing it. Just leave it in these. You can buy fancy boxes to store it in. You can buy different kinds of devices to put it into in different containers. But in all honesty, these are quite sufficient as long as your environmentals are good. If your environmentals are good and you got that cool, dry place, ammunition's fine to stay in the boxes you bought it in. When we talk about the different kinds of ammunition, a lot of people have questions about what kind of ammunition do I need to carry, maybe in a defensive role or in a hunting role or whatever it is that you're going to use your ammunition for, and then what kind of ammunition do I practice with? And what it really comes down to, a lot of that decision is made by cost. So it's cost and bullet performance, but the two are very much similar to each other and they're married to one another. So most people, when they go to the range, will choose a bullet weight. So in other words, if you're going to carry a 124 grain defensive bullet, then you should probably practice with a 124 grain regular bullet. In other words, the weights will be the same and they will shoot similarly. Now, the difference is the effect on target is different because you have a different kind of projectile. Now, when most people go to the range, they'll use what we call a full metal jacket or ball ammunition. That's kind of a military term, and you'll hear that. What it means is the bullet is actually completely encased in a metal coating. Now, it may not be completely encased to the rear. Sometimes it's just the nose of the bullet. But when you look at the actual bullet, the actual projectile, if it's completely encased in a metal, a copper usually, or usually a copper, you'll see that that's a full metal jacket bullet. Those are typically less expensive, and they're typically what people will shoot at the range with. Now, the other kind of bullet that's very prevalent is a hollow point bullet. Now, a hollow point bullet obviously has a hollow cavity in the front of it. That hollow cavity is designed to aid in the expansion of the round once it hits the target. So when this projectile actually hits the target it's supposed to, that hollow cone allows that bullet to open. And when it opens, it becomes more effective. So typically when people carry hollow point ammunition, they're carrying it for defensive purposes or for hunting or something like that, not just range shooting. And the other reason is hollow point ammunition is typically quite a bit more expensive. So you've got two kinds of ammunition concerns that you're looking at, and you're basing that on not only what you're going to use it for, but how much is it going to cost you. Now there's other types of ammunition in the market. You'll see all different kinds of exotic materials that people use to make bullets. These are typically constructed of lead at the core, but you'll also find that there are bullets that are made of all copper. They work very well. You'll find that some indoor ranges and some even outdoor ranges where you're shooting hard targets like steel will require to use what's called frangible ammunition. So you'll see that term out there as well. The most important thing is wherever you are going to go practice, make sure you know the rules and the regulations for that either indoor or outdoor range, because that's going to drive what kind of ammunition you have to buy to practice at those places. And then when you start looking at a defensive ammunition or a hunting ammunition, also know what are you looking at for what we call terminal ballistics. In other words, what does the bullet do when it actually hits the target? And that's where you'll start doing some reading and listening and talking to people who carry, and they'll tell you more about that kind of stuff. You'll find that there's a lot of opinions. Try to look for the facts. The facts are a hollow point bullet will open up a little quicker and it will have better effect on target. So typically that's what you're going to go with when it's a defensive round. So because there's so many choices and so many different types of cartridges, don't be afraid to ask questions. You know, this is all something new, and whenever we're experiencing something new or learning about something new, feel free to ask questions. Ask questions of the people at the gun store. Ask questions of other friends of yours that you honestly appreciate their opinion and think that they'll give you good information. Do a lot of reading. There's an incredible amount of resources out there about bullet technology and terminal ballistics and the things that you need to know about what kind of cartridge to carry. So make a smart choice, but make an informed choice. And just ask those people around you that you trust. They'll lead you in the right direction. We're going to talk a little bit about how we grip a handgun. So the two basic handguns we've talked about so far are revolvers and semi-automatics, and you use them both very differently. The way you grip them, the way you control that handgun is completely different for the two different systems. So we're going to talk about a little bit of the do's and don'ts and why they work and why they don't work. So starting with the semi-automatic handgun, obviously if you're a right-handed shooter, you're going to take your right hand and you're going to place it on the handgun. Now what you're doing is you're getting your trigger finger over the trigger well, and this is what we call the saddle of the gun. What you want to do is get the saddle of the gun up into the meaty portion of your hand as high as you can drive it. The reason you're doing this is if you slightly air down, what's going to happen is you're going to create slop, you're going to create space, and that's going to be a real common theme as we talk about how to grip guns. When you drive it in, you've actually made full contact with the top of the beaver tail on this particular gun, and now you can grip it and your trigger finger is in the correct space outside the trigger well. Now as we rotate this gun over, you'll see that my hand has full contact with this weapon all the way around, except for there's an opening, a space here. The important aspect of this is covering as much surface area of this grip as we can. It's going to give you control over that weapon, especially during recoil. And so, uniquely, this space that is created fits very well in the palm swell of the other hand. So if you will take that palm swell and you will place it down into that grip space, you have to lift your thumb up a little bit. There's the space created. We lay our hand down in and press it, again, firmly against the grip of the gun, and then your thumbs will now lay flat across. Now if you look at all the way around the grip, we are covering as much of that grip as we possibly can, which is going to give us great control of this handgun. Now you'll see people that cross their thumbs like this. You'll see people that lock their thumbs. You'll see all different kinds of styles. Thumbs really aren't as important as what some people may make them out to be. Typically, if you will point both your thumbs at the target, or in other words, point in the direction the pistol's being pointed, you're going to be in good shape. You can kind of lock those thumbs and adjust them as you see fit, but they provide extra stability because, again, it's another extension of your grip and more placement on the handgun. You'll notice, too, that your thumb is now right where it needs to be for the safety, and your trigger finger is outside the trigger well because, again, we keep our finger off the trigger until we're ready to fire the weapon system. So everything as it should be. Now, you'll see people do some other things with a handgun. They will either, we talked about this one, not drive their palm swell up into the trigger or up into this swell point. If you don't get it all the way up, you lose control. The gun will flip and it will move around in your hand. The other thing you'll see people do is they will not cover this space. They will either put their hand in front of it or they'll put their hand back here. Now, if I wrap this thumb over top of the back of this thumb, you can see, if I rotate this underneath, how much space is created between my hand and the surface of the pistol. Again, that creates slack, and you don't want to do that. Cover up as much as you can, lock in your thumbs, and you'll be able to do it. The last thing is you'll see what we call cup and saucer. Cup and saucer was an old revolver setup. You'll see people still do it sometimes. But what it does is you grip the gun normally with your firing hand, and then this is the cup, this is the saucer. They'll set this down in their hand to shoot. While it's a method to shoot, it's not the most stable because, again, as I roll this over, I'm neglecting to cover much of this grip that could give me better purchase on the gun and better control of the handgun. So, again, covering up all those aspects of it and sandwiching your hands in together and covering as much grip as possible is going to be your best bet on a semi-automatic handgun. Another important feature when you're dealing with a semi-automatic handgun is we did talk about driving this up as far as possible. A lot of people will want to lay the other hand over top. So they'll get their hand back over top or they'll get their thumb over top of this. The problem with that is you've got this slide mechanism that's going to work backwards. This slide mechanism, if you've got your hand above this, that slide when it comes back has these sharp edges on these operating rails, and those sharp edges will ride and gouge your hand. It will cut you open quite badly. So when we grip that gun, we can drive up as far as we want to into the beaver tail, But the problem is we don't want to go any higher than that, because when we get higher than that, now we're into where the slide could cut us or hurt us, tear our skin when it comes back. So just something to think about. Keeping your hands as high as you can in the actual way the grip's designed to be used, but not getting above it. It gets a little unsafe. Now when we go to a revolver, some of the principles still apply. Revolvers, we're going to take our firing hand and we're going to cover as much of that revolver handle surface as we can, again keeping our finger over the trigger guard. And when we rotate the handle over, we'll notice that on this particular handgun I actually cover much more of this grip than I did on the larger grip on the 45. So on this semi-automatic I had much more space here to fill in with this opposite hand. Now be cautious with revolvers, because revolvers have something unique that the semi-automatics don't have. Right here where the cylinder puts the cartridge, and then when it fires it goes into the barrel, there is a small gap, a small opening, and it has to be there in order for this cylinder to operate and rotate. So because of that small space there, when the cartridge is fired, a very high pressure volume of gas in a very, very narrow stream pours out of both sides right where the cylinder meets the back of the barrel. You need to be very cautious of how you grip this handgun. If you were to grip this handgun like you would grip a semi-automatic weapon, your thumb is right where that gas jet will come out upon firing. When that happens, it will very much damage the end of your finger. Anything you get in front of that gas coming out of that cylinder space is going to cut you, and it'll cut you very bad. It's a very high pressure and very thin layer of gas, and it's like a razor blade. So we don't want to take the same grip approach to a revolver that we would with a semi-automatic. Obviously, we don't want to cut the end of our thumb off. So we're going to back that grip up a little bit, but still cover as much of the grip as we can, because remember, the more grip we cover, the more we control the handgun. So we're going to cover up that grip as best we can. People like to lock their thumbs in different manners. You can do whatever you want. Again, this being the critical line we don't want to cross. And again, we also don't want to cross it this way. Trigger fingers are safe because trigger fingers will be in the well when you ignite that cartridge. So this doesn't matter because it can't fire and get the gas. This is where you fire, and now your finger's safe. So remember, this is your line of safety, and you want to do as much coverage as possible. Now we talked about the old cup and saucer. Again, this is where firing this handgun came from. This is where that technique came from, because this palm swell can fit in this space when you cup and saucer. A lot of people still like to do this or do a modified version of it. Maybe not so much teacupping it, but modifying it slightly, and now we have good control of this pistol. So different styles of approach to different grips on different kinds of handguns. A lot of similarities. We're still trying to cover up as much of that grip as we can in order to control it, but we have to alter the way we adjust our hands on the handgun based on what kind of handgun it is. As a firearm owner, you're responsible to safeguard that firearm from either someone stealing it from you or from children or an unauthorized user in general. So there's a lot of different ways that you can store that firearm in a safe manner so that if in fact it does get in the wrong hands, it can't be used, or it can't be used readily to do someone else some harm. So let's talk about some of those options that are available to us. Most weapon systems, most pistols specifically, will come with a type of gun lock. This is a very typical gun lock. What it is it's got a key lock. It's got a flexible cable. The flexible cable can be routed through the chamber opening into the barrel and out the other end, and this rendering this gun inoperable. A round can now not be chambered into this pistol, and it cannot be fired. Standard locks come with all weapon systems that you buy, so any handgun, rifle that you buy is going to come with a lock system. So be familiar with that lock system and know that if you don't buy anything other than that, this is a system that you can use. Now, if you want to go to something different, we'll look at this small lockbox here. This small lockbox is a real simple setup. It's a key lock system. So key locks, you retain the keys, the firearm stays locked inside. One of the benefits of these systems too is they're very small. I use these when I travel on the airlines because this is one that TSA likes. It's very secure, it can't be pried open, and this is a system that they like to see when I travel with my handguns. The other nice feature about this is a lot of people want to carry firearms in their car. But just because you can carry it in your car doesn't necessarily mean that you can take it into work or into a school or a bank or other places, so you're going to have to leave it in your car. Firearms, specifically handguns, are heavily pilfered out of cars. A lot of criminals break into cars specifically to steal handguns. So what's unique about these is you can place your firearm in it and it comes with a security cable. The security cable can be looped around a permanent piece of your car, so maybe under the seat where the frame bolts to the seat frame bolts to the bottom of the car. You can take this, loop it around, and then this goes inside your lockbox in a small notch. When you close this and lock it, now when they try to take this, it's cable tethered. It's another defense system where they have to now find something to cut this cable or do something else. Hopefully somebody will see them before they get that accomplished. But again, we're just trying to make it more difficult and keep our firearms safeguarded. Again, pretty simple little lockbox, but very effective. And you can use it for a lot of things. Now, they do make fancier systems. This one is actually a three-way lock setup. So it's got a key lock, so you can activate it with a key if you have the key. It's got a touchpad system that you can pre-program a code, so that's not only in the buttons that you press, but the orders that you press them. So that's nice. It's another way to open it. And then this one's actually fancy. This one has a biometric reader, so it's got a fingerprint scanner. Now you can scan your fingerprint into this when you get it and program it to open for you. You can also, on some of them, depending on the model, make sure you check, you can add other users. So if you want other people to have access, other responsible adults to have access to your firearm, you can do that as well and program that in there. So again, this one gives you 3 different methods to open it, whereas the first one we discussed was just a key lock. Now, obviously vaults get bigger. You can go all the way up to a full-size gun safe that will hold all of your valuables, rifles, and everything else. And obviously that's a fantastic place to store your pistols as well. But if you don't want to have that enormous expense that a gun vault is, a smaller version like this, smaller than a regular size safe, is plenty good and very safe. Again though, you probably want to bolt this down to something because you don't want somebody to be able to just pick this up and walk away with it and break into it later. So securing this, just like we secured the small one to something, is probably a great idea as well. Now, there are some other devices like furniture that is designed to have hidden enclosures that you can secure firearms in. There's all kinds of different little end tables, coffee tables. They make little wall mounts that have hidden compartments in them as well. Those are great for very discreet protection of your weapon systems, but you're really hiding them as opposed to securing them. Now some of those, and the better ones, have lock systems on it. Sometimes they're a magnetic, sometimes they're a key, sometimes there's a series of things that you have to do to open it. And those are very good as well. The thing that's not acceptable is if you don't have positive control of your handgun, it needs to be secured. In other words, if you're not carrying it on your person, if you're not actively using it, if you're not where you can see and touch it within arm's length, you probably should secure it. Because children, criminals, or people that just are not authorized to be messing with your firearms will always gain access to them when you least expect it. So do your part and do your due diligence and lock your firearms up in a suitable container that works for you and works for the ready access you need to have to your handguns. But make sure that you secure them so that they're kept safe and others are kept safe. Now that you know about the kind of firearms we're looking at, now that you know the different types of handguns, different parts of the handguns, we've talked about ammunition, we need to talk about a plan. And that plan is an education plan. Again, we're new firearms owners, we're new to the handgun game. We need to figure out how do we use this new tool that we have, and that's through education. Proper education is going to mean that you need to find someone who knows what they're doing and teaches this kind of particular shooting sports. Handgunning is different than long gunning. Handgunning is different than precision rifle. You need to find an instructor, a qualified instructor, a vetted instructor that has the ability to teach you the things you don't know. Now, once you have that instruction, there's always good supplemental instruction. The internet will provide you with some good tools to be able to use in supplementation to shooting on the range. Nothing replaces actually pulling the trigger and sending bullets down range, because that is the definitive training. But you must make sure that you're doing that training correctly. Because if you're just doing shooting, you could be doing bad shooting as well as you could be doing good shooting. So we want to make sure that we're doing good shooting. So find a proper instructor and then watch videos. Panteo offers plenty of solutions for training. We have trainers that train in the very basic and the fundamentals. We have trainers that train all the way up through the essentials and the very advanced skills. You'll find all of those things on our website and many others. But remember, that's a supplement to actually training and actually shooting. We want to get out on the range and do that correctly. Now, the other thing we want to do is we want to educate those around us. If we don't live in a gun culture, if we are new to the gun culture, we need to make sure that the people around us understand what we do and why we do it. It's also good to steward that to other people. So remember, you are an example of what a handgunner will now be. So make sure you're a good example. Educate your children. Remove that mystique from owning a handgun. Children that don't know what something is and don't know that they're not supposed to mess with it and that it is something that is dangerous will oftentimes go and look at it, touch it, feel it, try to figure it out. Take that mystique away. Tell them about those. Educate them, just like you educate yourself. Again, all of this is new, and when it's new, we have to learn about it. The more we learn, the more we know, and the more we know, the safer we'll be. So make sure you educate yourself about your new firearm. Just like any sport, owning a handgun is also a sport. You'll find that even from the community level all the way up to the Olympic level, shooting sports exist. A good place to find those kind of things are at your local gun ranges and at your local gun classes. What you'll find is a lot of people there are active in some of those clubs, some of those sports, some of those competitions. What those allow you to do is not only hone your skills while you get to shoot, but what it also does is it provides you the ability to join that gun society, join that gun culture. And again, those will be new friends, new experiences, and new opinions and new ideas that maybe you weren't open to before. But now you can share those ideas, share those training experiences, and get to compete in a fun way. So make sure that you get out and look for those venues. And again, a lot of those places that you'll do that are at the local gun ranges. So check that out and see if it's something that interests you, because it's a fun way to get involved in shooting. People buy handguns for different reasons. Some people want to keep them in their house for defense. Some people want to keep them in their car because they travel a lot, and again, they feel safer with a handgun and being able to defend themselves. Some people actually want to carry that handgun. They want to carry it on their person. If you fall into those categories where you're actually going to carry or travel with your firearm, you need to be very cognizant of the laws. Those laws will change from state to state. Some states have open carry laws. In other words, as long as you can see the weapon visibly, you're okay. Some states have a permitting process that if you want to carry a weapon concealed, you have to go through the permitting process, which usually requires a class and a fee. And then they issue you a card that lets you do that. Some states don't allow for that carry at all. Just as important as knowing what's legal in your state and keeping yourself on the legal side of the law, what you also need to do is you need to know the adjacent states to you, or the states that you travel in most often, because you need to know whether they have reciprocity. In other words, your carry permit in your state is accepted by that state, or even the states that you're traveling through to get there. All of that's very important, and it'll keep you out of trouble, and it will keep you within the law. Because again, with this big responsibility that we have as a firearms owner, that carrying and that knowledge of the laws is as important as anything else. So make sure you know those laws, make sure you're smart about what you do, and make sure you stay on the legal side. Owning a handgun can be a rewarding experience for a lot of different reasons. It can provide you some sense of security about protecting your loved ones. It can provide you a link between adults and children and something new that you can do together. It can provide an heirloom that you pass down from generation to generation that's appreciated throughout the family. It can provide you with a lot of different things. It's right for some people. It's not always right for all people. But the key to all of that is education. Once you educate yourself on what it is you really want to get out of a firearm, a handgun in this instance, then you know what kind of purchase you need to make. Then you know if it's right for you. In the end, you may decide it is or it isn't. That's okay, you know more. And the more you know, the safer you can be. Having that handgun and having that ability to use it will open doors in different areas. It'll allow you to meet different people. It'll allow you to experience different experiences through the training that you'll go through to become proficient with it. So if you do decide to own this handgun, enjoy it. Enjoy being part of that gun culture. It is a different world. It's a world that has rules and laws. We must abide by those. But again, it's something that can be cherished for a long time and passed down through generations.